Hello everyone and welcome back to Bizarre Podcast. Before we start today's episode, I just wanted to wish you all well and I hope that you're all keeping very safe and sound. As we all know, these are troubling times at the moment and I just hope that today's episode can bring some kind of distraction and enjoyment for you. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the ghosts of Flight 401. And please be sure to stick around after the show as I've got a bit of news for you about the new podcast. And without further ado, let's get on with today's episode.
Welcome to Bizarre Podcast.
Shortly before midnight on December the 29th, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crash-landed in the Florida Everglades, which resulted in 101 fatalities. Years later, certain parts of the aircraft were recycled and used on other aircrafts. It wasn't long before reports of sightings of the deceased crew members of Flight 401 started to circulate. Is it possible that due to the traumatic nature of the deaths of the passengers and crew, that their ghosts somehow became attached to certain parts of the doomed aircraft? On that fatal day that the aircraft left from John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, New York, to make its journey to the Miami International Airport in Miami, Florida, it left with 163 passengers and 13 crew members on board. The pilot was Captain Bob Loft, aged 55 years old. Captain Loft had flown for the airline for 32 years. He had flown 29,700 hours throughout his career, which included 280 hours on this particular aircraft. His flight crew included First Officer Bert Stockstill, who was 39 years of age, and he had a total of 5,800 hours of flight experience and 306 hours in this doomed aircraft. The second officer and flight engineer Don Repo, aged 51 years, had 15,700 hours of flight experience, and that included 53 hours of experience on this particular jet. And there was also a fourth man in the cockpit that night who was simply along for the ride. Technical Officer Angelo Donadeo. The man was aged 47 and he was officially off duty. The flight was all going well and to plan. That is until they started to prepare for landing when the aircraft started to make its approach into Miami International Airport. The instruction was given to lower the landing gear. Only problem was, when the landing gear was lowered, it was normally accompanied by a green light on the cockpit panel, which told the flight crew that the landing gear was down and locked into position. But this light indicator had not illuminated. Bob Loft contacted the tower in Miami to inform them that they needed more time and they were going to be delayed whilst they figure out if the landing gear was definitely down or not. The tower gave them a new flight pattern and instructed them to climb to 2,000 feet. This had them flying over the Florida Everglades. Second Officer Don Repo was sent down beneath the flight deck to look through a small portal to confirm that the landing gear was down. Whilst Don Repo was down below, Captain Loft instructed Bert Stockstill to place the plane in autopilot mode. Everything should have been fine. The plane was more than capable to fly in autopilot mode. After all, 2,000 feet was still very high, and there was no buildings or mountains around in that area that would be in the way. And for the next 80 seconds, everything was good. But then, all of a sudden, the plane dropped 100 feet, and then flew level for a further 2 minutes. None of the crew members seemed to notice this drop in altitude. It is believed that maybe Loft had accidentally knocked the flight stick, which brought the plane out of autopilot. After 2 minutes of flying level, the plane started to drop gradually. So gradual, no one noticed the plane's descent. 70 seconds later, the plane had dropped 250 feet. The plane was now so low on altitude, it triggered the warning chime, which would be found on the engineer's workstation. The problem was, the engineer was down below looking at the landing gear, so unfortunately for some reason, the alarm went unnoticed. In fact, when audio was later played back, there was no evidence that any of the pilots heard the chime. After another 50 seconds, the plane was now at half its instructed altitude. You see, they were flying over the Everglades, so the ground was dark. There was no lights, there was no civilization in that area, there was no traffic, no buildings, nothing, no indication that the plane was so low to the ground. Bert Stockstill noticed something amiss when he started to turn the plane 180 degrees. After the accident, the following conversation was taken from the flight recorder. The first voice you hear on the recording is Stockstill. He said, "Did we do anything to the altitude?" The second voice is Loft. He said, "What?" Then Stockstill says, "We're still at 2,000 feet, right?" And then Loft says, Hey, what's happening here? 10 seconds later, the plane crashed. It was travelling at 227 miles per hour when it smashed into the ground. Due to the plane doing its 180-degree turn, the left wing hit the surface first, and then the engine, and then the undercarriage. The plane came down in a very violent manner. It was totally ripped apart and disintegrated, scattering the wreckage over 1,600 feet. The back part of the plane was the only part still somewhat intact. Most of the fatalities came from the midsection of the plane. Due to the plane landing in the Everglades, it is thought that the impact was somehow absorbed by the swamp, which is probably why the aircraft had some survivors. And also, the mud in the swampland could have prevented some of the survivors from bleeding out, because it covered the wounds they inflicted. Although the swamp did cause many infections, but I suppose under the circumstances this was more than acceptable. Out of a total of 176 people on the plane, only 75 people survived. Sadly, a total of 101 people lost their lives. Captain Bob Loft died in the wreckage of the cockpit before he could be taken to hospital. Bert Stockstill died on impact. Don Repo survived the crash but later died of his injuries. The only survivor of the cockpit was the off-duty technical advisor, Angelo Donadeo. After that fateful night, the crash of Flight 401 went down in history and has never been forgotten. It was the first time a jumbo jet had ever crash-landed and caused fatalities. But there is another reason why Flight 401 has been remembered all these years, and it is tied to the supernatural. You see, it was rumoured that eventually salvaged parts of Flight 401 were refitted into other planes of the same model, and then employees of Eastern Airlines started to report sightings of ghosts of Captain Bob Loft and Second Officer Don Repo, but only on planes that had the salvaged parts refitted onto them. In 1973, one of these planes was boarding for a flight to Miami. First to board the plane was a vice president of the airline. As he made his way to the first class cabin and found his seat, he then noticed a captain in full uniform standing there in the first class section, and so naturally he approached the captain and started a conversation with him. As he was chatting with the captain, he suddenly realised he was talking to Bob Loft, the Bob Loft who had died in the cockpit of Flight 401. As soon as the vice president realised he was talking to a ghost, Bob Loft simply vanished right before his eyes. The vice president was very understandably shaken and bewildered, and he ran from first class in hopes of finding a crew member. He was terrified that his sighting may be some sort of bad omen, and some horrible accident may follow. But this wouldn't be the last time that Bob Loft would be reporting for duty from beyond the grave. A few months later, crew members apparently had a conversation with a mysterious pilot sat in the flight deck. They had absolutely no idea that they were talking to the deceased Bob Loft. So you can imagine when the ghost vanished in mid-conversation, the flight crew were rightly scared out of their minds, and apparently the flight was cancelled that day due to the crew being too afraid to come back on board. And so it would seem that Bob Loft had decided to haunt these planes. But it would be Don Repo's ghost that would make himself known to the staff on more occasions than Bob Loft did. On a separate flight, a flight engineer arrived early to carry out important pre-flight checks. The engineer was surprised to see a gentleman sat in his seat when he arrived and immediately recognised the gentleman as Don Repo. The engineer stood there, scared stiff, unable to speak. And then the ghost of Don Repo spoke. He said, "You don't need to worry about the pre-flight checks. I've already done it." And then he vanished right before the engineer's eyes. A few weeks later, the ghost of Don Repo was seen once again by a captain, and once again Don Repo was looking over the pre-flight checks. He turned to the captain and said, "There will never be another crash on a L1011. We will not let it happen." On another flight, it is said that the flight deck crew enjoyed their meal as the plane flew on autopilot at 39,000 feet. Suddenly, there was a loud knocking coming from beneath the cockpit. The same place that Don Repo had been on that fateful night, on board Flight 401. Quite fittingly, the area below the cockpit was also called the Hellhole. The loud knocking continued, over and over. The flight engineer had opened the hatch and peered down into the hellhole, and caught the gaze of the apparition of Don Repo staring back at him from the shadows, and then he vanished. Upon further investigation, the engineer discovered a problem with the equipment that could have been dangerous, possibly fatal. Cabin crew members also reported seeing strange apparitions on board their jets, where the ghost was simply disappear into thin air. On one particular day, this was witnessed by a crew of caterers who ran off the plane and refused to go back on. Also, the ghostly pilots have been known to appear in the main part of the planes, along with the passengers. One lady who was sitting next to a pilot on board one plane called the stewardess. The lady was worried about the pilot. She thought he looked ill, as he blankly just stared forward ahead of him. As the stewardess approached, the pilot simply disappeared. The lady apparently was so hysterical that they had to restrain her until she calmed down. Another lady passenger on a different flight also sat next to her unresponsive pilot. She tried to talk to the man, but he simply did not answer or give any indication he was even aware of her existence, and then he vanished, leaving the woman terrified. Apparently both of these passengers were shown photographs of the deceased pilots of Flight 401, and both women identified the ghost to be that of Don Repo. On another flight, a stewardess was preparing the food in the galley. As she went to open the oven, she noticed the image of Don Repo in the reflection of the oven door. The stewardess was not sure if she was seeing things, so she shouted for a colleague to come and see if they saw what she did. And they did indeed. This time, the reflection of Don Repo looked like it was trying to speak, like he was trying to say something, and then the ghost spoke. The ghost of Don Repo warned, "Watch out for fire on this plane." Later, as the plane set off on its return flight, they had an engine failure, which was caused by fire, and the plane turned back and landed safely. And it was also rumoured that the galley where the apparition appeared in the oven was salvaged from Flight 401. Now, one thing that we must consider is that when these ghosts appeared, they didn't only appear to one person, but sometimes to many. On one occasion, a stewardess noticed the captain sitting in first class, and once again she noticed that the captain was unresponsive. Like before, he just stared blankly ahead. The flight attendant went to speak to the captain of the flight, the living captain, and asked if he was aware of the captain who was sitting in first class. She thought that maybe he was deadheading, a term given to staff flying home whilst off duty. When the captain approached the phantom captain, he gasped. "My God," he said, "it's Bob Loft." And with that, once again, the ghost of Bob Loft simply disappeared into thin air. So you see, on this occasion, more than one person actually saw the ghost of Bob Loft. Even when the ghost appeared to the passengers of the plane, often than not, more than one person always saw the phantoms, or so it was reported. On another occasion, an engineer was asked to fix a faulty oven on board one of the planes with the cursed components. A stewardess noticed the engineer fixing the oven in full engineer's uniform. Later in the day, another flight engineer reported to the galley to repair the oven, and noticed it was not faulty but working fine. The stewardess informed the engineer that another engineer had repaired the oven earlier that day, but the real engineer insisted he was the only engineer on board. Later, the stewardess identified the mysterious engineer as none other than Don Repo. It would seem that Don Repo was still making repairs even after death. And then there were lots of other sightings, from a thick mist forming into a solid three-dimensional face, to simply seeing Loft or Repo standing in the aisles or on the cockpit before simply disappearing. And like I said earlier, many of the sightings were reported by more than one person, and the ghosts always appeared solid and lifelike. Another thing to remember is that these sightings were all apparently reported in the plane logbooks, and statements were given by upstanding, respected people who were not known to make up something so unbelievable. I think most of these sightings came to light with the release of John G. Fuller's 1976 book, The Ghosts of Flight 401. This book was full of reported sightings of ghosts, which we have already mentioned, and they all spread over a 4-year period. Apparently they were the truthful testimonies from the airline employees. Fuller wrote in his book that the airlines were constantly trying to cover up the reports, and apparently every time an employee wrote in the logbook would mysteriously just disappear. One of these log entries that apparently disappeared, apparently this log entry was written on the same day that Don Repo appeared in the oven reflection. Apparently the log reported of the ghost of Don Repo helping or instructing how to land the plane after the engine failure due to the fire.